Welcome to all of you to the Chairmen's Roundtable, organized by the Center for Corporate Governance, Indian Institute of Management, Bangalore. I am Raghunath, Professor of Strategy and Chair of the Center. And I am very pleased to be joined by three doyens of the Indian industry to discuss a very important topic. We have Mr. Seshsayee with us, who was until recently the chairman of IndusInd Bank. He was also the chairman of Infosys Limited. And prior to that, he was vice chairman of Ashok Leyland and also the president of the Confederation of Indian Industry. Welcome to you, Mr. Seshsayee.
Thank you.
We are also joined by Mr. Sunil Munjal, the chairman of Hero Enterprises. He's one of the founder members of the Hero Group, one of the premier automotive manufacturing companies in India. And he's had the distinction of also being on the Prime Minister's Council for Trade and Industry. And I welcome him.
Thank you, Professor.
And we are also joined by Mr. Suresh Narayanan, the chairman and managing director of Nestle India Ltd. Prior to this, he was also the chairman and managing director of Philippines until 2015. The most important thing to notice about him is ever since he's taken over leadership, they have won the Best Governed Company Award in 2018 for the excellent governance of Nestle in India. Thank you, Mr. Narayanan, for joining us.
Thank you, Professor Raghunath. Thank you.
Wonderful. So we are coming to you live from Bangalore, and we would like to say a warm welcome to all of you. There are some of you from North Africa, from Middle East, from China, from Singapore, from Indonesia, and of course from India. And a warm welcome and a good afternoon and good evening, depending upon where you are. As I said, the topic of discussion today is of paramount interest to all of us, and therefore we are here today. And the question is, if a board is an oversight body which actually monitors value creation and value appropriation in corporates, in the recent times where the industry has been ravaged by the COVID-19, obviously the stakeholders in the entire value chain have been deeply affected along with the companies. Therefore, the question arises, how do we, as custodians, as stewards of value, of those who would like to sustain shareholder value in the longer term, also balance questions and concerns which relate to stakeholders? I would now like to invite Mr. Seshsayee to start our discussion. Mr. Seshsayee.
Thank you. Good afternoon to everyone. In the very nature of running an organization, whether it's in manufacturing or services, you create value. And there is constructive tension in terms of distribution of the value amongst the various stakeholders. And this is a trade-off that you constantly keep doing as you run the business. Do we need to put up the prices more in a market where you've got a dominant position? Can we therefore leave less on the table for the customer and more profit, more for the shareholders? Or should we keep the prices at a low level in order to get a market share for the future? Should I outsource now all the work that I'm doing in-house so that my contractor can have a lower labor cost, and therefore I can make better margins and better profits for the shareholders, while the employees, the stakeholders, the group who are contributing to the development of a product will probably get a lesser value share. So there is constant tension, and there is this trade-off in terms of the long term versus the short term, in terms of the equitable distribution of value between one stakeholder and another stakeholder. This is common ground. But I think the issue that today I believe that we are discussing is in the context of COVID, which is a black swan event, which is an event risk that has happened. Is there a change in the manner in which we look at and allocate the value distribution amongst the stakeholder, I think that has to be answered with two dimensions. One is that it is a black swan event. This may not occur again. You may not have another event risk happening at all, or you might have a pandemic happening next year. You might have a technology kind of a risk, a malware completely immobilizing your platforms for some time very early in the future. So do we therefore do things in order to protect ourselves against such event risks? If you're, for example, in US and you are dependent on China, there is a raging discussion going on. Should we de-risk by taking it away from China to some other place? This might result in a lower profit to the shareholders, higher cost in terms of the material procurement. Is that a safer way of managing risk? Or should we say, no, we will not worry about event risk. We will only look at what is sustainable risk. Or you could have a situation, the second dimension of that is that this is not about risk management. This is not about placing bets on what the risks are going to be. This is about an ideology. This is about social conscience, because that has come to the fore in an event risk like this. We have this very sad spectacle of the informal sector labor being left in the lurch. So is this the responsibility of the corporate citizen, of a corporate entity, to ensure that there is minimum wages being paid by your contractor, even though law may not ask for this? Is this something as a wake-up call to the conscience? So we have to really debate this question on these two dimensions, if I may suggest that way. One is risk to be provided for in a way that takes care of all possible risks of the future, event or otherwise? Do we now need to look at issues of shareholder compensation versus other stakeholder compensation in the context of ideology, in the context of the fact that the soft belly of Indian industry, for example, has been widely made public? So is this something that we can live with? My very, very brief answer before I pass on to the others is that event risk is not something that you can provide for completely. You can provide for risk management, risk mitigation of known knowns, known unknowns, but not unknown unknowns. On the second issue of the dimension with regard to ideology, I do think that there is a social conscience of a corporate body that needs to be addressed. It is important to ask some of these questions. See whether law, by being an exemplar, can you raise the bar of the law? Can you influence the raising of the bar of the law so that there is more equitable distribution of the value amongst the stakeholders? I'll stop there.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Mr. Seshsayee. Mr. Sunil Munjal, would you like to add?
Sesh has put it wonderfully. I would just add two more dimensions to this. Since board is the senior most governance body in a company, they need to demonstrate to the management and all the people within the company that they are around, they are available, they are supporting the management, because this is a massive humanitarian crisis that's going on. So, and this is something every company is doing. The chairman is making himself or herself available to be seen by the people, to speak with them, although these are usually on digital media. I think that's one. Second is they need to both allow and encourage the management to look at what they can do in terms of exigency planning. Because exactly as Sesh said, this is not something that anyone had planned for. This genuinely is a black swan event. All of us do some contingency planning in our companies, but nobody around the world, even though, by the way, we've known for 20 years something like this is going to come, but nobody had actually planned for this. So it's important to both allow and encourage the companies, the management teams, to build small groups to tackle this absolutely unforeseen crisis. There is also a need for the board to become less burdensome at this time, because many boards constantly ask for reports whenever there's any crisis in a company. Rather, I would say they should go the other extreme and offer to form a committee of the board that's available to the management to consult and inform anytime on an ongoing basis. And I am seeing that happening in some of the companies. So that decisions which are not normal can be taken, especially those which require board confirmation or board information, can be taken literally on the fly. And I'd stop here. There are 2 or 3 more, but I guess we'll cover them subsequently.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Munjal. Mr. Suresh Narayanan, your thoughts?
Thank you. I firmly believe that a crisis, whether it is a black swan event or indeed any crisis, is the time when character and compassion speak to competence. So for me, there are 3 elements here: competence, character, and compassion. And I believe that whether you are the management of the company or whether you are the board of directors of the company, there are really 5 core issues, and I call them the 5 Ps, that become extremely important for a board of directors to evaluate. Number 1, first P is perspective. Mr. Seshsayee rightly said this is a black swan event, and Sunil went on to add a further flesh to it in terms of the dimensionality of the perspectives. But I think the perspective is very important. How big do we see it? How wide do we see it? How manifest do we see it? And what are the various dimensions of this COVID pandemic that we face? The second P is people. I think for me, the core of any organization are the people that work in the organization, whether it's an organization of 100 or 100,000. I think you can have factories and you can have offices and you can have all the glitz and glamour that can be destroyed. And yet you cannot build back that business unless you have culture and people to really go with it. So I think the people dimension is something that the board should be extremely interested in. The third is, this is the time, crisis is the time when you hark back to values and purpose. These are not empty words. These are not statements put on the walls of companies at the entrance or in the boardrooms, but this is the very heart and essence of the organization. At Nestle, certainly we believe in our purpose very, very strongly, and we go back to it and to our values in time of a crisis. The fourth element is really partnerships. The ecosystem of a company, however large or small it might be, is much larger than itself. You can have farmers, you can have suppliers, you can have distributors, retailers, customers, you name it. How do you ensure that at the time of a crisis of this kind, you secure and at least try to be like a banyan tree, which is to protect the partnerships that have led to the business of your company to be successful? And the last P is prospects. Really, the board needs to understand what will be the business of this company going forward, what are the risks that the company carries, and these are the issues that Mr. Seshsayee also talked about in terms of competitiveness and in terms of positioning. In terms of the industry, what are the kind of risks that the industry carries, and therefore what risk does the company inherently carry being part of that industry? What risks do we face from consumers, changes in consumer behavior? I think during this period, we have rapidly seen changes in consumer behavior in favor of issues around trust, around quality, around safety, moving away from an out-of-home experience to an in-home experience, for example, in my industry. So that is going to redefine the way in which companies look at their innovation pipelines, their portfolios, and their value chain. Customers, I think customers are getting redefined, channels are getting redefined, route to markets are getting redefined. And last but not the least, the environment. What is really going to be in the environment, whether it is regulatory, whether it is in terms of governance, or indeed other practices. Recently, SEBI took out a guideline on the 20th of May that really talked about the various issues that need to be dealt with by a company going through a crisis in terms of materiality and disclosures. So these 5 elements, I would really urge be the kind of bedrock on which the board of directors deliberate. As Sunil rightly said, the board has to be seen, the board has to be heard, the board has to be felt. Leadership at this time is not distant. It is close, it is vulnerable, it is receptive, it is compassionate, and it is competent. So that's where I would leave the opening remarks on this whole subject of board and the board governance.
Wonderful. Thank you so very much. Those 5 Ps that you talked about, perspective, people, purpose, partnerships, and prospects, is something that companies have to look at in this changed circumstances. So would you be able to share some of the instances how you're testing your business strategy with regard to the impact it is having on various stakeholders? Could you give us some?
I think, look, one of the things that we do is that our board is fairly close. We do interact a fair bit. We may not have formal board meetings at this point in time, but because of the virtual capabilities that we have got, we are able to discuss various issues. And in fact, one of the things that we had done at the last board meeting was to take the board of directors completely through all the 5 Ps that I talked about. So on people, for example, I think one of the things we have done is, and I'm blessed to be part of Nestle. I'm blessed to be part of an organization which has a revenue stream. So therefore, I'm deeply grateful for that. And one of the things that we really took was to ensure that our people are protected in terms of jobs, in terms of salaries, in terms of increments, in terms of promotions, in terms of all the offers that have been made to people to join the company, in terms of summer internships, in terms of management trainees, whatever we had to secure, we secured. In terms of partnerships, we work with 100,000 farmers in the Punjab. We have been working with them for the last 60 years. They have been giving us milk that started with 311 liters in 1962. Today, we are collecting almost 300 million liters plus from these farmers. So these 100,000 farmers, one of the things that we have assured is during this period that every single drop of milk, every single day, during this entire COVID period is collected and is processed and they are paid on time. I think this is the time when transparency and trustworthiness and the backbone of values has to stand up. And we do that not only to our dairy farmers. One of the mandates that we have for all the MSMEs, and we work with a number of MSMEs, small suppliers, large suppliers, people who give us cardboard boxes, people who give us flavors, they give us various raw materials, spices, etc. What we have said is we have taken a mandate and we monitor this as a crisis committee, which I lead for the company. We meet every 2 days. And one of the points in that is how many suppliers are operational, how many suppliers need to be made operational, how many suppliers need help and support in terms of permissions to start, in terms of help, in terms of sanitation, hygiene, social distancing, etc. How many of them need their orders to be given? How many of them need to be given advance payments? How many of them need to be secured? I think one of the promises that I have taken to myself, and I hope that God gives me the strength to live by it, is to ensure that no MSME sinks under the banyan tree of Nestle. I think if corporates are able to protect as best as they can, and I know that I am in a privileged position, so I'm not saying this out of any altruistic sense, but it is also in a sense that where my revenue streams are moderately protected, I think it is important for me to ensure that like a banyan tree, the ecosystem of partnerships also remain and maintain themselves. So like this, we have done numerous initiatives around the community, around our people, our frontline salesmen, our ordinary distributor salesman who gets 10,000-15,000 rupees a month has been, and we were one of the first companies to give a COVID insurance, because we said, if anything happens to these poor fellows, their families are going to be afflicted. This is the time when compassion has to reach out. I think we will find our ways of managing the cash flow, managing our P&Ls. I think there are competent people and there are business skills to do that, but the heart has to flow to compassion towards the people who work. I think this is what defines the character of an organization, and I hope to live up to it in all that we're doing in the coming months, in the coming years. Thank you.
Thank you so very much. Mr. Munjal, the automotive industry context is very different. So would you like to share your thoughts?
Certainly. So the points being made by Suresh are actually just perfect. They are on the nose. But as you said yourself, there are industries which have gone through a different cycle based on which sector you were in. The automotive industry, as you mentioned, actually went down to a position where the month of April saw 0 sales in the domestic market. This is the first for the industry itself. I don't think in its history it's ever had any such situation. So the companies are focusing on 3 things. One, to look at what they can do for the immediate to conserve cash. That has become absolutely critical for companies. And second, companies were looking at the medium term how do you prepare yourself for a turnaround when you come back into the market, which companies have now done. So I'm talking about what was happening a couple of months back, is to prepare a plan, a protocol, preparation of the people, the places, the systems, all to be able to safely get people from home to work. And this is being done for the entire value chain, all the supply chain partners, dealers, distributors, because this is, as you know, the automotive industry is 49% of the manufacturing industry in India. It's a giant dominant industry as far as manufacturing goes in India. And it has a big impact on the system. And the multiplier of each OEM is very high in terms of the value chain itself, on dealers, distributors, logistics suppliers, et cetera, et cetera. So companies have been and do need to look at the entire value chain, exactly as Suresh said. The same thing has been done in the automotive industry. The second thing companies are looking at right now is efficiency. That when I come out of this, how do I come up with a completely new cost model? Because the current cost model has become a burden because the way businesses have worked. Because this is a global phenomena we are seeing, not just in India. So the three things people are most focused at, this is other than the humanitarian stuff I'm talking about now, the business side only. One is innovating the business model. Second is looking at how more technology can be used in every aspect of the business. And technology could be by way of using massive computing for design. It could be by looking at big data, analyzing how you deal with customers. It could be in the manufacturing process itself, more robotics, more artificial intelligence, more machine learning. And the third one is on people, because a lot of the unskilled and semi-skilled workers in India across the country that come from mostly the eastern part of the country, Bihar, Eastern UP, Orissa, Chhattisgarh, MP, etc. Many of them have left their places of work and gone back home. And exactly as Sesh said, unfortunately, this is a crisis in itself because it's been done very poorly. Many are walking home, some are cycling back home. And companies need to figure out a way to get in touch with their own people, figure out a way to support them, and knowing fully well, some of them will not come back in a hurry and some may never come back, to have another set of people available who are retooled, retrained, and reskilled. Because even though we say it's unskilled and semi-skilled, but the reality is every individual who comes into a company is actually trained to do some job. And that training is going to be necessary to provide to all the new joinees. And there will have to be new joinees. But many companies are also looking at a working model which will work with a higher efficiency and less number of people to do the same thing. And in some cases, even to do more than they were doing.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Mr. Seshsayee, you've had the unique privilege of actually having a position as the chairman of the board in the automotive industry, in the software industry, as well as in the banking industry. So how would you summarize the comments that we have heard so far?
I think both Suresh and Sunil gave an excellent presentation of what typically a company's management and the board together should do when they're faced with a crisis, right? This is really a case study, the way that these two organizations have faced this crisis. I'm sure there are many other organizations which have done the same. And there are other organizations which want to do it. They don't have the capability to do it. They might just be on the margin of survival, and therefore they might want to do many things, but they don't have the wherewithal to do it. So I think you have a canvas of these kind of reactions to crisis. But the common thread, to answer your question, is that you've got to find, at this point of time in a crisis, to go beyond the normal metrics of profitability, return on equity, and so on, to look at what sustains the business. What are the foundational values that sustain the business? What are the partnership equations that sustain the business? And then strengthen those. And that's one common value right across all industries we would do. And the second is that every challenge also brings about an opportunity. So you will discover that this presents a different kind of an opportunity for your business, or it might be for a different business. And I think the talent lies in really identifying that wave of opportunity that you want to ride on when the crisis is over. That's the common thread. But if I may, Professor, I think, Sunil and Suresh beautifully dealt with the right responses from a company, and from both on the management and the board in relation to crisis. The question that you raised as a topic for the day is still something which I think we need to hear from both of them, which is that this COVID has highlighted the 2 points that I said. One is that this is an event risk. So how do we manage in a VUCA situation? We've all heard of the VUCA situation. Unpredictable kind of risks happening, right? How do I prepare a business to face unpredictable risk? One way of doing this is that when business risks are undefined, unpredictable, uncertain, then you don't take financial risks. You have more of risk capital. You have more of equity and less of debt. So lower leveraging is a appropriate response in order to face uncertain times which might have undefined, unpredictable risks. So that's one issue. And the other issue also that I'd like to ask both Suresh and Sunil their views is that isn't this a time that we really have to start looking at what is the erosion that has happened in our foundation. That erosion, if it is left to remain in the foundation, can bring down the structure at a future date. The erosion has become just visible to us. The fact that a very, very large part of the labor force is contributing to building up of the superstructure of industry, at the apex level of which sit many, many industries such as his and mine and Sunil's and so on. At the very bottom level, we've got a completely wobbly kind of situation where we have people who have been contributing to the development of this edifice without being taken care of in terms of the guaranteed wages or guaranteed jobs. Is this a part of the collective conscience of industry to address? If so, what should we do?
Wonderful. Thank you so very much. Mr. Narayan and Mr. Munjal, any reactions?
Sure. Suresh, you want to go ahead? Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead, Sunil.
No, go ahead. You'd start.
Look, I think Mr. Seshsayee has put a very very valid and a very clear question. I think, in my own experience, since I've also either had the fortune or misfortune to be navigating the company through different crises, and I think when we had the Maggie crisis 5 years ago, that was a kind of a call where the rock started to show when the tide was turned back, and we knew what were the kind of what's and what were the kind of difficult issues that we had to grapple with, both as an organization, responsiveness, agility, anticipation, and also being somewhat of an amoeba during the time of a crisis, to be able to morph the organization to the expectations and to the reality that faces you, rather than to be rigid in terms of some of the structures that we have created. I think it goes back again to strongly to the purpose of the organization. I have a statement and a theory that I always keep espousing. I say if companies were to invest as much in culture as they invest in capex, I think we will have a lot of extremely well-run companies. And what Mr. Seshsayee has addressed on issues on fairness, on compensation, on looking after the people who are really the making and responsible on which the edifice of the company stands, goes back to the purpose of the organization. So at least at Nestle, what we really believe very strongly is that apart from our own employees who are privileged to get a lot of things that go with the quality of the company, That's why we have tenure people in my company, people spending 30 years and 35 years. It's very, very common because people are happy with the culture, happy with what they make, what they get, and how they are looked after. We also look at one level below that. So people who are either contractually employed with us or indeed are employed on a short-term basis with us. We ensure that we do not shortchange them in any way. We also have got mechanisms within the company, I'm sure all large companies have it, of what we call supplier development teams. Their task is to go to suppliers and to actually see that none of the principles of decent, fair wages, health facilities, and employment norms are being violated. And if they are, then that supplier is immediately censured as far as the organization is concerned. So I think in these ways, we do try and see how best we can operate to ensure that there is a principle of transparency, fairness, and sustainability. And we also take it to the area of things like organization, structure, process, innovation management, everything. I think Mr. Seshsayee is right. A crisis of this kind throws up numerous areas where the company can work on in its commercial process, including the future range of products and services that it will offer. I think the crisis is redefining our own commercial processes, our innovation management, our platforms on the value chain, organizational imperatives, structures will change. I think the work from home, which we were, I must confess, reluctant to implement in the first place, as a sign that we might be allowing people to not give their best, today is giving their best, and therefore we have got redefined. So I think there are numerous opportunities that a crisis of this kind throws up positively for a company.
So since Sesh has asked both of us this question, so part of my answer actually has been given by Suresh already. And Sesh knows this well. We've always been a very people-oriented organization, exactly like was mentioned by Suresh. We have very low attrition in our companies. In fact, earlier we used to have zero attrition. Now in the last 20 years, we have some attrition, but still exceedingly low relative to the industry. So the investment in people is one of the things that we are always committed to. Because eventually, please remember, all of this is only about people. And I think that's also the reason Sesh is asking this pointed question about the very fundamental value system with which business operates in this ecosystem currently. Now, we have seen today, what has happened is when the millions of unskilled and semi-skilled workers, whether they were contractual, they were on the company's rolls or not on the roll or daily wages, when they have started to walk away. First, by the way, I have to tell you, in many companies, there was a sense of relief that my wage bill will go down, because that was the concern in many companies. And then the realization that it's not just a wage bill walking away, it is people going away. So part of my skill is also going away. And then the realization that this is a humanitarian crisis of what's happening. And many companies went out, opened their cafeterias, kitchens to feed anybody walking by the roads, especially those that they knew were at camps or not, or had no other place to go to. So to be fair to companies, they've done a tremendous job in this. I think overall, we need to question ourselves as a country about how we operate, how we look at the human resource, how we look at people at every level in the organization who add value. And by the way, all people add some value, otherwise they should not be there. And these are people whose value can be directly attributed when they come and work. And especially those places we keep them for daily wages and others. It's literally on a day-to-day, hour-to-hour basis, you can add up the value that they're adding. Now, it's also a fact that no crisis should go to waste. So I think it's time for us to make some of the changes. So what we have been doing ourselves internally, we've said, let's look at 5 Rs. So since Suresh started off as a professor with a few Ps, let me start with the 5 Rs that we are using in our company. And by the way, in full disclosure, I'm not involved in our automotive business any longer. So we've restructured the businesses. I'm doing many other business. We do have an automotive business, but that's not a major part of what we do. There's insurance distribution, there's steel cold rolling, There is real estate, there is auto components, there's training business, and then there is an active investment office is what we do as our major activities right now. And we've said we have to demonstrate resolve to address this squarely, this situation and every aspect of the situation, the today, the coming out, and the future. We have to renew everything, the way we look at things, the way we do things, the way we even approach issues. We have to therefore demonstrate resilience in the current period. We have to use reimagination, and then we have to reform. We have to come out of this better companies and better human beings. Both are necessary. And if enough companies in India start to do this, I think India itself will start to look different. It is important that we don't forget that while profit is an important outcome of business, it cannot be the prime motive when you start any business. The prime motive has to be to meet a felt need of a product or a service, get the appropriate people on, get the right processes in place. And that's why a good management plays a key role. And that's where a good board and how it governs an organization demonstrates its value system. Because eventually, at the end of the day, the philosophy with which we live, each one of us, must permeate the organization. Otherwise, you're not being true to yourself. And it's only when you're true to yourselves that your true potential actually gets tapped.
Wonderful. Thank you so very much. So the 5 R's, beginning with resolve and going all the way to reform. So the question that comes up to me when I listen to all of you is, now we know that there is a very strong linkage with the external stakeholders, and the internal stakeholders are undergoing change in terms of the way they work and the way they interact and what happens within the company. So how is the board actually facilitating this management of change, which is an extremely difficult process, because as you all know, that implementing anything is very different from conceiving it. So what would be your thoughts on this? Mr.
Sorry, can you repeat the question, please?
So now that we know that it is very important to be reactive and proactive with the stakeholders, and it is important to bring that change within the company, and therefore the internal stakeholders, the way they work, the way they interact, the way they deliver, all of that is undergoing a lot of change. So being a oversight body in the board, how are we planning to facilitate this kind of change, which is consequent to whatever is happening in the environment?
You know, over the last several decades, when I've had the privilege of being on maybe 20-odd boards and watching managements with a different kind of culture and competence, I have a theory which may not be acceptable to everyone, which is that the board and the management have a symbiotic relationship. The board should not be heard or seen if the management is delivering performance, is upholding values of the organization, and is in the right path. The board should be unseen and unheard. But if there is any deficit that you see in any aspect of the performance, the board has to come and fill up that. And that would have to be done on the basis of very constructive engagement with the management to get them to go in the right direction at the right pace in that particular area. It might be in relation to changing the organizational future with regard to business. It could be change in terms of the way that people issues are being dealt with. It could be a change with regard to the financing of the organization. It could be many things. But wherever there is a deficit, the job of the board is to identify that there is a need for a change. If the company is going in eastwards at 40 degrees, but it has got to go northwards, then it is the job of the board to say, company management, you got to go from east now 40 degrees to north 90 degrees. And that's the way that's got to be, it's got to be pushed. And that process will vary from board to board, management to management. With more responsive management, the board has less job to do than just indicate where it needs to go persuasively. With a less responsive management, I've had to sometimes go very deeply into the process of literally pulling the management in the direction that it needs to go. So I think change is something that has to be constantly being discussed and the consensus built because each one perceives the future differently. Future is not something which is not in the present. Future is pretty much present in the present. You got to identify that spark which will make the change happen in the future, and each one of us will have a different way of identifying that spark. It is necessary to have a constructive conversation between the board and the management, within the board, and so that we all see the sparks the same way after due debate and arrive at what we think should be the right kind of direction to catch the spark when it becomes a flame.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you very much. Mr. Narayan?
Yeah, I think Mr. Seshsayee said it extremely well. I think if the leadership and management of the organization are doing the things that are essential, that are important, that are constructive, and that are adding value to the organization, I think the board of directors should be probably heard once in a while, but need not be seen too often. I think that's important. But I would just like to offer probably for boards that may not have this kind of due diligence or this kind of confidence, a list of 10 questions that we discuss on our board and sometimes which comes up, and I'm just trying to articulate that. I'll do it very quickly. Question number one is our executive leadership adequate? I think that's a call that the board takes from its experience. Number two, does the organization and leadership carry the right mandate? Number three, are we reinforcing management effectively? Number four, are relevant stakeholders being adequately informed? Number five, are we thinking of how to navigate the post-COVID future? Number six, are we taking care of ourselves, which is the people and the management? Number seven, are we testing strategy and its impact on customers? Number eight, how are we planning to integrate consequent changes? Number nine, what are the best and worst case scenarios indicating? And number 10, does the company have the leadership, emotional, intellectual, and resource bandwidth in the post-COVID world? So these would be 10 typical questions that you would ask if you are not able to satisfy yourself in the manner in which Mr. Seshsayee first put forward. Either or all of these questions could help. These are some of the issues that certainly in our board we have been grappling with.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you so much. Mr. Munjal?
Most of what I would have said actually has been covered by the two of them.
Okay.
And since you have only 15 minutes left, if you like, we can carry on to the next question.
Yeah, sure.
I can just add the dimension of using the board at this time to focus on strategy of two types.
Okay.
One is the strategy that will get you out of this safely, which is the company, its cash flows, its leverage, its technology, its product, and its people, all of them.
Right.
And the second is coming out of this, how will you as a business be able to position yourself against competition? What are you doing at this time? As I said, no crisis should actually get wasted. And that's the focus we have in many of our organizations and also organizations that we are dealing with.
Thank you so very much. Thank you so very much. I think, yes, we are just left with 15 minutes. So I will turn to some of the questions that our attendees have sent us. And let me read out one of them. And the question is, companies that are over leveraged in times of such a crisis will hit the wall. So what should be the focus of the board in such times?
Clearly, and I think Sesh mentioned this earlier, leverage has been the downfall of many companies. And leverage by itself is not a problem, by the way. It's only when the leverage is taken in bravado, believing in your own ability beyond what it actually demonstrated on the ground. So conservative approach to leverage is always a sensible approach. So in a sense, what we have done always in our organization is have a very conservative strategy, but a very aggressive operation plan. So your operations will allow you to constantly grow even beyond what you actually strategize. And these are the two tools that we have used. And I'm just going up to 30,000 feet because there are many instruments which get used to actually make this functional on the ground.
Broadly, I would say that we are, as a country and as an industry in India, we are over-leveraged in the context of the risks confronting us. The risks of economic growth, the risks which relate to our ability to compete in the global market, given the current situation. And there are risks relating to even external trade. And in that context, I think there is a need now to deleverage across the board. And that's again at 30,000.
Mr. Narayanan, would you like to add?
Well, I think Mr. Seshsayee and Sunil have answered this question beautifully. I don't even think I'm competent to answer, being a part of a company which has got little or zero debt. So it's a very kind of theoretical question as far as I'm concerned. So my views would be already expressed in terms of the organization that I represent. But I think broadly what Mr. Seshsayee and what Sunil said, principally and conceptually, I would agree with them.
I should also reiterate, by the way, of the 30 plus companies that we ran as a group, as a part of the Hero Group, 90+% of them were running negative working capital cycles. Wonderful. So we are not active bank borrowers.
Right.
But the belief is clear that the strategy for leverage must always be conservative.
Wonderful. Thank you so very much. The next question is, will companies suspend payouts to shareholders for the next 2 to 3 years to maintain sustainability? And consequently, does the current stock market rally seem baseless?
You're asking me?
Yeah, please go ahead.
Okay, I think the first question will obviously depend on the individual company. If the company has got sufficient cash and profits, of course, it's going to be distributing, and if not, it is not going to distribute. But I think the second question is more interesting, which is the stock market completely unhinged from the real economy? That's a question that's been raging through the US markets now. Clearly, one would believe that the market is getting too hot given the current situation, and it's not justified in terms of the results. But having said this, I would say there are two things which are worth thinking about. One is that when interest rates come down to the level that it has come down to, some of them, in fact, you got several $1 trillion, I think $7 trillion, which is parked at negative interest rate across the globe. It would have an impact, undoubtedly, in terms of higher value for the returns you get on this capital. That's part of the equation. So therefore, that is something which is bound to happen, and therefore it is not completely unreasonable. So there is a justification partially as a result of the overall monetary situation that we have across the globe and the tremendous amount of liquidity that is earning practically zero or negative returns. Right. The second part of this issue is also that there is a lot of hot money which has to be parked somewhere because there is no investment taking place across the globe. So the savings, the global level of savings is in excess of the investment capabilities, the investment needs, and is unable to suck it. And that's lack of suction of this liquidity certainly is a concern because it's not going to go away suddenly, but it's a concern that it is distorting the valuations and misleading, therefore, investors to believe that they have wealth, which is probably notional and will remain notional for some time.
Okay.
I can tell you two interesting conversations that have been held at some boards right now. One is to say, should we keep the markets impressed and continue to pay dividends at the rates we were paying them earlier, even though our cash situation is going to be strained. And on the flip side is companies who have liquidity, who have the cash, who have the margins from the earlier year, saying, would it not be sensible for us to be conservative and tell the market we're going to conserve right now and pay lower dividends or no dividends? So no dividend is a policy of very, very few companies right now, from whatever I'm hearing. In fact, most companies are saying we should pay something to demonstrate that we are still in business, but lower it to tell people what's actually going on. We should also, by the way, all of us understand and appreciate this crisis is not going away in a hurry. Part of the problem started immediately when the COVID-19 spread was heard of, and then the lockdowns, which were done in different countries with different severity, different level of intensity, have created a situation which is unlike any we have seen. The least that I would expect the full economic turnaround is 2 years right now. So, and I'm not talking whether it's a V-shaped recovery or a U-shaped or a W-shaped or whatever is going to happen. And we can talk about that. I don't know if we have time, but that's a separate conversation. So it is absolutely critical and imperative that companies understand that they have to continue to conserve cash for a while, because there are two types of businesses, one which have benefited from, three types of business, one which have benefited from this situation, and two which have taken a temporary beating, and third, which have taken a beating but will, temporary beating, and third, which have taken a beating and they will never be able to get up from this. So they will either be shrunk businesses or will shut down and not be able to reopen. We will have that. It's a sad thing to say, but that's a reality that we are facing right now. So it's absolutely essential for companies to focus on their own situation before they make commitments of cash out. The stock market itself in the long term do demonstrate how the actual performance of a company is. But in the very short term, especially in markets like India, where there's very, very low depth, you put $1 billion into Indian market and the stock market just shoots up. And we've seen it happen over and over and over again. And with the world issuing negative bonds, who could have actually even dreamt of this? There are bonds that have been issued last week with the negative carry that you give your money and you give them money to carry your money. It defies imagination, but that's a reality today.
Exactly. Thank you so very much. Mr. Narayan?
Well, I think in the interest of time, I think Sunil has very, very succinctly sort of captured the debate that is happening in boardrooms between whether we need to conserve or whether we need to pay out in order to be still considered the good boys. And I think some of the issues that he talked about, whether of business continuity on the three-phase approach, either getting impacted or getting impacted mortally or recovering at some period of time. I think those are the issues that are being discussed. But I fully agree to one of the statements that he has made very categorically, is that this crisis is not going away in a hurry. So those of us who assume that, in Q3, Q4, we'll be back to humming again, I think we'll have to re-examine that.
Wonderful. Thank you so very much. I would now like to invite closing comments for our participants, the takeaways that you would like them to have in terms of what are some of the changes that you actually foresee in board practices in terms of the emerging scenario today.
Two things. One is certainly, I think, as we said earlier in the opening discussion, that there is certainly going to be a greater attention paid to some of the core values of the business in terms of how we deal with people, how we deal with our processes, dealing with people. So I think there is going to be a more fundamental re-examination of the values, both including values to the society. And the second is also there will be a heightened awareness of risks, and risk management will become even more critical now. So while we have seen a pandemic as a risk, it's possible that we would also have a technology risk, something that completely mobilizes communication, not beyond imagination. So I think we would be looking at, for example, an issue like cybersecurity a little more intently at the boardrooms now. These two are certainly going to be changes that I think you will begin to see in boardrooms across the world. But there is one thing which I wish the boardrooms will discuss, but may not get discussed, and that's about the fact that while we have had a pandemic, which is a rather a quick killer, we also have a situation such as a climate change, which is a slow killer. And while this has sort of awakened our conscience in terms of what we owe to the society, I wish that the boards, corporate boards, become more conscious of some of the slow killers in the environment, such as climate change, and apply themselves to more sustainable kind of business. It has happened. It has happened, for example, just when US was declared that they were going to come out of the Paris Agreement for sustainable future. That was the time I think over 1,200 companies got together and pledged that we are still in. We are going to commit ourselves to zero emission. We are going to commit ourselves to zero green gas. I think Suresh's company was one of that, which said that by 2050 that we will have zero, green gas. So therefore, I wish that takes also some space in the board, because if law has to change, if nations have to become more conscious of some of these environmental issues, exemplars in the corporate world will have to lead the way, evangelize. Therefore, the law then catches up.
Exactly. Wonderful, wonderful. Exemplars in the corporate world. Wonderful. Yeah, Mr. Munjal?
I think in some sense, we all said this in our opening itself, that the role of the boards is going to be of a higher order of responsibility for sure in the future, because of the realization that we were not doing enough on some fronts. And one, of course, is what Seshsayee just said. In our companies, we've had this term that we've used very often, is tread lightly on this planet. And we've actually practiced this for the last 6 decades, not just now when environmental concerns have gone up, by putting in effluent treatment plants 50 years ago in our bicycle company, by creating the world's largest green roofs in some of our plants. So things of this nature is also the relationship between the people, all the people who work in the organization. I think the boards need to lay down a clearer philosophy to which the managements need to align, or if they don't, then the management need to be changed to be able to align to that. Because if you do not all believe in the same strategy, companies will have more disruption than others. This current crisis is also telling us that we need to be better prepared in terms of flexibility for quick course changes when required by businesses. And one thing we've seen for sure, that while change has been constant, but the pace of change in the world has changed. And I'm not talking only about the COVID right now. I'm talking about the way the world is developing. The use of technology is going to become all pervasive. And technology is a wide umbrella word. It's in many different aspects it will come in. So even the most conservative businesses need to understand that they have to use technology. Otherwise, they will get left behind. And the market will get a little bit more brutal, if it's not a very strong word. It will become brutal in terms of competitiveness, and Indian businesses have to be as competitive as anywhere in the world. So our ability to look beyond our nose is very important. I must not be just the best in this city. I have to be best with somebody who's working in Oklahoma or working in Okinawa or any other place. So a much more global outlook is necessary, because it's only then that the world itself and the countries and the leadership of countries will start looking at globalization again. Because at this moment, we've started to reverse the trend. You cannot stop information, you cannot stop data, but you can put up walls for physical people movement and goods movement. And that is going to be very disruptive. The direction we are going in right now is actually headed for automatic conflict. We have built a conflict into this. So it is important that boards of organization of every size play an active role in aligning themselves to each other, to the national goals, as also the global good. while continuing to focus on the laser sharp focus on efficiency and productivity. Because I'm not talking of quality and customer service, because those are taken for granted now. If you don't have those, you will just not be in business.
Exactly. Exactly. Wonderful. Thank you so very much, Mr. Munjal. Mr. Narayanan.
Thank you. Since we are almost out of time, and both Mr. Seshsayee and Sunil have covered a lot of ground, so let me keep my takeaways very, very short. And since Sunil was kind enough to rib me on my little professorial 5 Ps, let me close with what I believe the board needs to look at, which is the 3 Cs. The first C is culture and ways of working. I think this needs a very close examination in the COVID crisis and beyond, because you would have seen the aspects of culture which have worked and not worked during this crisis, and what made a company capable of standing on its feet and what made it fall flat on its face. I think that really comes from culture and ways of working. Number 2 is competence, both the leadership competence, the organizational competence, the capability that it has, the inner workings of the organization to understand whether this company is set up for the future or is likely to flounder as time goes on. And the third one, which is also been encompassed by both Sunil and by Mr. Seshsayee, is competitiveness. Is this business going to be competitive? Is it going to be sunset? Is it going to be a new sunrise? Or is it going to be a new reality? Which of these is this business looking at coming to? So culture and ways of working, competence and competitiveness is what I believe the boards would need to look at progressively. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Just one more, Professor. There are many questions which have come. I can see those, some of them. If you want, you can please feel free to send them to us.
Right, I'll do that.
We can send you responses if you would like.
Yes, we will organize to do that, and we will post the answers back to our attendees. So thank you so very much. We've had an excellent conversation with such a distinguished panel, and on behalf of the Center for Corporate Governance and Citizenship of the Indian Institute of Management, Bangalore, and on behalf of all attendees, I wish to very gratefully thank you all, the 3 of you, who are actually facing a time crunch in terms of what is happening today in the industry. I thank you heartily for your time and your efforts, and for the wonderful conversation that we have had. And a big thank you to our attendees for having been with us on this conversation. And I would also like to bring to the notice of all of us that there have been people behind the scene who have worked very hard. Ms. Gurita Varghese, the Chief Operating Officer of the Center, Mr. Sangamesh, the IT head who has actually run this entire roundtable from the back end, and Ms. Sudha Gurunathan, who has been an excellent support on the administrative side. Thank you very much. Wish you all a very safe and a very progressive life in very difficult times. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.